You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and let's give you the update that most of you thought would be coming. At least I think most of you thought the story of Micah Miller would have additional chapters. And as of Friday afternoon, the next chapter has begun. So there's a quick reminder here. 30-year-old Micah Miller was the wife of 45-year-old pastor John Paul Miller of the Solid Rock Church in South Carolina. John Paul had been married previously, and he is the father of 5 kids. And yes, there is an age difference between Micah and John Paul, which had some of you worked up when this story broke earlier this year. Because John Paul became the pastor of the church in 2016, and it was reported he had courted Micah from the time she was young. Back in April of this year, Micah was found dead in the Lumber River State Park, this from an apparent suicide. Now, for a lot of you listeners, the idea of her dying by suicide was not so easily accepted. Well, one day after her death, John Paul announced her passing during it was just a weird sermon. It kind of gave you the ick, but I won't assign it that. I just know that's how some people felt about it. But he gave this sermon at his church and announced that his wife had died. Then he went on and warned his congregants that he would be taking a break from his duties. Well, as the investigation into Micah's death proceeded, allegations of abuse by John Paul surfaced. Micah's family was sharing details that Micah had documented prior to her death. She had written that John Paul had groomed her from the time she was 10 years old. She also documented that John Paul was very controlling and wouldn't even allow her to drive sometimes. Days after her death, dozens of demonstrators held a Justice for Micah rally in front of the Solid Rock Church. They were highlighting the abuse allegations. And during the investigation and the fallout, John Paul had granted an interview to ABC 11, where he said he was not to blame for his wife's death. And he called those who were questioning him the, quote, biggest idiots on the planet Earth. He said he had never abused her and that he was the one actually keeping her alive for so long. But there was some damning evidence. John Paul did admit to News Nation that he had posted a topless photo of Micah online. This was shortly before her death. He went on to apologize for the topless photo posting, but most of the public was outraged that a pastor would treat his wife that way. Well, following her death, in late June, John Paul and Micah's family decided to kind of basically end their legal disputes. They were squabbling over Micah's estate settlement, and that's a very, very simplified idea of what was going on there, but this is just a recap. So they were really arguing, and they kind of decided to just kind of part ways and just agreed on things. Then, after that, we really didn't hear much. That was until Friday, when the FBI descended on John Paul's house in what was reported as a court-authorized law enforcement activity. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 agents. About 25 agents searched the home. Neighbors reportedly said John Paul was not at the home during the search, and John Paul's attorney told the Post and Courier that an affidavit was not attached to the search warrant, so he basically said he couldn't confirm what the agents were looking for in the search. Don't know if that's true or not, that's what he's saying. So with that information, we're just gonna have to wait and see what happens with that search, but there's more. Just 3 days before the search, Newsweek reported that John Paul was making some business moves. He had filed court documents with the South Carolina Secretary of State for a new religious incorporation called Living Water Church at Market Common. Now, the business address, it's listed as John Paul's home, so that checks out. But on the business paperwork, it kind of links John Paul's mentor's mother. Yeah, that's a total mouthful. But the mother of John Paul's mentor, she's the one who's assigned to take over the assets of the church if everything's dissolved. Now, Solid Rock Church, that's the old church, it still exists apparently, but Newsweek confirmed that there is no working phone number or email address for that church. So that doesn't really match the plans that were announced by that church back in May. They had said they were building a new church and a tuition-based school for 1st through 9th grade students. So maybe they're just abandoning the Solid Rock name and they're going to go with the new name and they're going to start a new church and education program. So I wonder if the search by the FBI will alter those plans. I'll just keep you updated as more information becomes available. And when I saw this story on Thursday, I knew I had to bring it to you because, well, frankly, it's nuts. Have you guys heard of Peanut the Squirrel? He makes his home in Elmira, New York. Well, he has an Instagram account with over 532,000 followers and a Facebook account with 423,000 followers. And then TikTok followers, well, that's kind of his kingdom or his nest or his forest. I don't know what you want to call it. But on TikTok, Peanut has over 2 million views on his stories. And there's this super fit man named Mark Longo. He's Peanut's caretaker. Mark took Peanut as his pet 7 years ago when Peanut was just a kit, which I learned is a baby squirrel. Now, Mark had seen Peanut's mother get hit by a car, and so he rescued the little nugget, and he grew him into an internet sensation. After rescuing Peanut, Mark decided he needed to do more, so he went on and moved to Elmira in 2023, and he started an animal sanctuary named Peanut's Freedom Farm. So if you want to look all of this up, it's P'(nuts), and it's everywhere. The animal sanctuary is a 501c3, and it's an approved nonprofit. Mark said in an online post that the animal sanctuary relied heavily on Peanut's internet fame, basically to fund the operation. In those posts about Peanut, you can see this squirrel. He's wearing these cute little tiny cowboy hats, and sometimes he's eating things like waffles, and he's wearing little crocheted bunny ears. And Peanut and Mark are buddies. Peanut rides around on Mark's shoulders, and sometimes he's poking out of a pocket. And Mark is seen snuggling this cute little tiny animal. Well, in this post, Mark said the sanctuary has rescued 350 animals since its founding, and he also clarifies that the animal sanctuary has veterinarians and caregivers, and they all help everything function. Okay, all of this, well, it was at risk on Wednesday because Peanut was confiscated. He was taken away by the Department of Environmental Conservation. Now, the DEC served a warrant to Mark and others at the sanctuary due mostly on complaints by do-gooders who say the animals, like Peanut, are unlawfully possessed. Now, this led Mark to make an online post that read like this: "Well, Internet, you won. You took one of the most amazing animals away from me because of your selfishness. To the group of people who called DEC, there's a special place in hell for you." Well, Mark also said in that post that the DEC planned on euthanizing Peanut along with a raccoon that was also seized from the sanctuary. Now, the DEC, for their part, back on Wednesday, they were saying that the animals were seized in coordination with the Chemung County Health Department, this all due to the presence of a rabies vector species in a home. Well, the internet has taught me that a rabies vector species is a classification for raccoons. Now, Mark is asking for people to contact the DEC, or at least he was back then. He wanted people to call them in protest against the government's actions. He told his online followers that the raid was similar to how authorities would raid a drug dealer's home. Now, back then, on Wednesday, at first, I keep saying back then, you guys, this was just all breaking over 3 days. But back on Wednesday and Thursday, the DEC was not answering questions about whether they had euthanized Peanut or his housemate, Fred the raccoon. They had back then confirmed they conducted the seizure after an investigation was launched because multiple reports had been filed that Mark was illegally keeping wildlife as pets. Mark said he was aware that he had erroneously failed to file a form saying he had a pet as a squirrel. Okay, who even knew it was necessary to file a form to keep a pet squirrel? Who knew? Anyway, he was saying in his post that he would willingly file that paperwork. He just wanted Peanut back home with him. Now, the links for the petition, they're in every article. So if you wanted to see how many people had signed it or whatever, that's out there as well. You could just search Peanut, the squirrel, on social media. You're going to find all his social media sites and all the updates. But I'm just trying to give you just this brief synopsis. Okay, here's where it turns sad. Late Friday, Mark gave an update about Peanut to TMZ. Here, let me just play it for you.
We just learned that they have euthanized Peanut.
And the raccoon as well.
And the raccoon as well. I am so sorry. This must be really difficult for you.
It not only tears my family apart, but Peanut was the cornerstone of our nonprofit animal rescue. And 10 to 12 DEC officers raided my house as if I was a drug dealer. I was sat outside my house for 5 hours. I had to get a police escort to my bathroom. I wasn't even allowed to feed my rescue horses breakfast or lunch. I was sat there like a criminal after they interrogated my wife to check out her immigration status, then proceeded to ask me if I had cameras in my house, then proceeded to go through every cabinet, nook, and cranny of my house for a squirrel and a raccoon.
They got a search warrant?
They got a search warrant. 4 departments and a judge signed off on a search warrant for a squirrel and a raccoon. And then they took them and killed them.
Why did they go through all that to get a search warrant for an animal that had been with you very safely, and the world witnessed this for 7 years? Why now suddenly did they show up with a search warrant and take these animals?
We haven't a clue. We don't know who made the complaints. Again, Peanut was an indoor squirrel, not harming anybody. He's been with us for 7 years. Not a single complaint was ever filed for this animal. We had him for 7.5 years. He became the world's most famous squirrel. We weren't hiding him by any means. He was all over TikTok. He became the first squirrel on TikTok to ever hit 1 million followers. He did every news station around the world. He's helped people. He's helped kids gather joy. And then we started a nonprofit animal rescue called Peanut's Freedom Farm to help animals like Peanut fight a good fight when they're in a neglected case or they're sitting in a slaughter auction. And he was the cornerstone of our life and our organization. We used his platform to help raise money for the 300 animals we have at our sanctuary.
You heard that right. Mark confirmed that Peanut has been euthanized. The AP is reporting that Peanut bit one of the DEC workers, and that was why the squirrel was put down. Well, Mark confirmed on Saturday that he hadn't seen Peanut bite anyone, and he also confirmed that the authorities aren't talking to him about the seizure. Okay, I'm going to guess some of you will be so outraged by this story. I'm guessing that because online chatter has people furious that the government would take these aggressive measures for a raccoon and a squirrel. But you guys, guess what? This isn't the first time this year that the DEC has been in the news. Back in March, an older alligator was seized by the DEC in upstate New York. This alligator, named Albert, was old and huge. He weighed about 750 pounds and he was roughly 11 feet long. The owner of Albert had built an in-ground swimming pool to house the 30-year-old alligator. And that owner claimed the alligator was so domesticated that children could enter the water with the alligator. Here's the problem in the situation. The owner of Albert did have a license to own the alligator, except that license had expired in 2021. And when the DEC showed up to investigate, they said the alligator's pool and holding area did not meet the standards required to keep the gator as a pet. Okay, for me, here's the crazy part about this story. The license only became an issue following a change in regulations for possessing dangerous animals. So in 2020, the DEC adopted new standards, and that's why the holding area did not meet up to what was required. But the owner of Albert felt like he should have just been grandfathered in and that he was meeting appropriate standards for Albert. Well, back in March, the DEC declined to comment on where they had moved Albert to be housed, only saying that what they called an ailing alligator was now with a licensed caretaker. I would love to know what you guys think about this. Is this too much government regulation? Or is this exactly what pets need to be protected, or what people need to be protected from dangerous animals? It's all weird. Let me know in the comments on social media and on YouTube. And now an update to a trial I covered back in July of this year, the young thug Rico trial. Now, I supplied an update back then, not really with any breaking news or that this trial was finished or that someone had confessed. I was just bringing you an update to the saga. But now we finally have somewhat of a conclusion. This after 10 months of jury selection. Yes, I did say 10 months. And then 11 months of the trial in this disastrous case that's now kind of stalled and turned into a moment. So here's what happened. On May 9th of 2022, Jeffrey Williams, or Young Thug, was arrested. An 86-page indictment had been drafted. Atlanta prosecutors alleged that a crew or a gang, it depends on who you're asking, well, that crew called Young Slime Life had been dubbed by the Atlanta DA's office as a criminal organization. And they said Young Thug was the king of that crew. Well, after they arrested Young Thug, they went on to arrest another 28 additional co-defendants. Eventually, after the 10 months of jury selection, 9 of those co-defendants took plea deals. And then a dozen co-defendants were severed from the case because basically the prosecution had thrown everything out there and some of what they threw didn't stick. So those dozen co-defendants, they just got let off the hook. Now, the prosecution was claiming that Young Thug and the others who were involved, they said they were planning a murder and that they had also been involved in racketeering. When I brought you the update in July, it was in part due to the length of the trial and also the swapping out of judges. And that gets us to late October, where the longest trial in Georgia history hit a huge snag on October 23rd, when one of the state's witnesses made a big whoopsie. That witness said that one particular defendant was still, or at least had been, behind bars. Okay, for me and you, that probably seems like not that big of a deal, right? Except this state witness got their information about the defendant from a document that should have had that information redacted. And in Georgia, jurors can't receive that kind of information. And the state's witness had just spilled the beans about one of the defendants. But if you think that was the only problem here, it wasn't. The state had slipped up multiple times. After the prosecutors allowed the jurors to hear about the incarceration of at least one of the defendants, one of the defense attorneys called for an immediate mistrial. Then another attorney did the same. And then basically all the various defense teams called for a mistrial. Here's what one attorney said. Now the jury has repeatedly heard about Mr. Nichols being in jail, being in prison. We cannot unring that bell. This behavior is happening over and over again, Your Honor, and we're not going to be able to unring 100 bells. All right, can you imagine the situation this placed Judge Paige Whitaker in? She responded with, basically disdain for the prosecutor's behavior. All of this according to Law and Crime. But she also tried valiantly to salvage the case since so much time and resources had been expended. Judge Whitaker said she was trying to fix the prosecutor's sloppiness. The judge did say she was feeling confident that the co-lead prosecutor, Simone Hilton, did not show the witness that paper. Basically, she said that when the witness was testifying, Simone Hilton was as surprised as everyone else that witness had said phrasing almost verbatim from that unredacted document. Okay, after this big snafu that occurred in late October and had culminated in almost the 50th call for a mistrial, the judge indicated that she was leaning towards a mistrial without prejudice, which means the state could bring the charges again against all of those defendants. So what did the two sides do with this complete cluster? They decided to work a plea deal with all the individual defense teams. And according to Law and Crime, each individual defense team began meeting with Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis and Chief Deputy District Attorney Adrian Love. And that cut the trial short on a Wednesday. Those meetings continued on until late into that evening and the next morning and even further. Now, they expected a resolution by that afternoon, but it didn't pan out. Judge Whitaker decided to basically call the trial off for the rest of the week as the discussions were continuing. Okay, all that happened, all those meetings happened, and when it shook out, Young Thug changed his plea to a combo of guilty and no contest. And it turned out to be kind of a really unconventional negotiation. There was no true agreement that was made without the judge involved. And she finally listened to everything and she accepted what was offered. Now, the first negotiated deal would have had young Thug out of prison with credit for time served. But he would have had an absolute of 23 years in prison if he went on to violate his terms of potential probation. Young Thug's defense team said no to that. They didn't like that the state could possibly alter the probation terms and maybe game the system to re-imprison young Thug. Now, when the defense turned that plea deal down, the prosecution came back with a much harsher punishment. So they were basically headed backwards in the negotiations. The prosecution asked for a sentence of 45 years, with young Thug being kept behind bars for 25 years, with 20 years of probation after that. All right, that led the defense attorney to, in rebuttal, accuse the prosecutors of lying, also misleading the court, and then manufacturing stories. The defense said young Thug was too good of a talent to keep behind bars. They even cited a quote by Elton John that said, young Thug was the second coming of John Lennon. After hearing all of that, Judge Whitaker accepted this deal. Young Thug would be sentenced to 40 years with only 5 years to be served behind bars. Then the judge commuted young Thug's sentence to time served. He will be held to 15 years of probation. But remember, the terms were at play here. So what are one of the terms? Well, are you ready for this? Young Thug cannot step foot in the Atlanta metro area for the next 10 years. Okay, that's got to sting a little bit for young Thug. Other defendants are now working on their plea deals. Specifically, Yat Gotti, he's rejected the state's latest plea offer, and his attorney is now saying they're going to continue with the court proceedings and ride it out. I don't know. There's going to be more that's reported here, and I don't know if young Thug can live up to those probation terms. We'll just have to see. And let's finish with the Maryland murder trial of 46-year-old Candace Craig. Because on Friday, it took a jury just 1 hour to find her guilty of murder. All right, here's the backstory. 71-year-old Margaret Craig, she's got a daughter, Candace Craig, and she's also got several granddaughters, but specifically one granddaughter named Salia Hardy. Okay, these three generations, they're so close to each other in all aspects. Financially, family, day-to-day activities, all of this while sharing a home. Basically, their lives are intricately combined. Well, Grandma Margaret, she had started noticing that her bank account had some discrepancies. And those sketchy account transactions dated back over the last few months. Finally, Margaret approached her daughter Candace with the weird bank account stuff, and the conversation didn't go well. She said she was trying to block certain purchases that had been attached to her account. And without help from Candace, Margaret opened up a separate bank account, which was supposed to be the one used for her automatic deposit of her government check. Candace didn't like that, so she enlisted her daughter in the scheme to get access to a debit card for the new account. Now, those attempts weren't working. So I think she was feeling backed into a corner with the allegation and also the blocking of the funds. And Candace then went on to grab a trash bag and she entered her mother's bedroom. She proceeded to use the bag to smother her mother because she needed to keep the money flowing. She needed that Social Security check for herself and her daughters. And she needed her mother to be quiet about it. So she murdered her mother. After suffocating Margaret, Candace took her dead body and she laid it in a blue tub in the basement for hours. Candace then went on to hatch a plan, which included buying a chainsaw at a Home Depot. She then, and this is gruesome, you guys, she used the chainsaw to cut her mother up into pieces in the basement, and then she transferred those pieces to the backyard, where she then grilled her mother on the outdoor barbecue. Now, to hide the smell of the charred human pieces, she heavily seasoned those pieces while grilling them. And then she went about her daily life. But Margaret had more family and friends than just Candace and Salia. And it took just a few days for those friends and family to report that Margaret might be in some kind of danger. When the police showed up at Margaret and Candace's home, they discovered the gruesome killing area or cutting up area in the basement, and they discovered Candace. And she was saying she was blameless. Candace told authorities that her 2 daughters, who both had disabilities, were the ones to blame for the grandmother's death. All right, now this trial was actually a speedy one for a murder trial. The murder occurred in May of 2023, and the 8-day trial culminated on Friday with the reading of the verdict. During those 8 days, over 30 witnesses took the stand, and more than 600 pieces of evidence were submitted for the jury to analyze. Candace's defense attorneys focused on the idea that the medical examiner had not been able to identify how Margaret died, except that she was murdered. So they felt that without that identification, the witnesses were just kind of canceling each other out. They also played on the idea that multiple people lived in the home, and so how could Candace take the fall for something that could have been done by any one of the house occupants? The defense team did concede that Candace and her daughter might have been thieves, but that doesn't mean that they were murderers. Now, one of the most damning moments, at least for me, in the trial was when it was revealed that Candace had called the bank just 1 hour after her mother's death and attempted to transfer $1,000 into her account from Margaret's account. Now, Candace will be sentenced at a later date, and her daughter, well, she's still facing charges related to the moving and desecration of a body. Let's remember Margaret. She was a retired nurse who had immigrated from Trinidad and Tobago, and she was known to love Caribbean food. Well, that's your Monday episode of Rise in Crime. Thanks so much for joining me here on Rise in Crime. I appreciate all the love that you've sent my way. Please continue to comment on the social media channels and on YouTube. And if you haven't done so, please leave a 5-star review and some positive comments. They help the podcast grow. We're grateful here at Oh No Media for all of the people who listen and share these stories with us. Join me again on Thursday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.